Why did Jack the Ripper start his murderous campaign? Students of true crime should know that there won't be one reason. That's how things are in the real world. The motive of a serial killer is not like the motive for a normal murder. Crimes of passion for financial gain, or those committed in the course of other crimes. This isn't an Agatha Christie novel or an episode of Midsummer Murders or the Rockford Files. See, I'm trying to make this channel more friendly to our cousins across the Atlantic Ocean, but perhaps I'm showing my age with that example. In an earlier film, I attempted to answer the question, why did Jack the Ripper stop? My answer upset some people who were hoping for a dramatic denouement, reminiscent perhaps of the scene at the Reichenbach Falls between Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes, or alternatively perhaps via the culprit unaliving themselves, as we must say in these uncertain times, or the more faint-hearted or squeamish might prefer the culprit being imprisoned for some other crime, or detained in a lunatic asylum, or even possibly fleeing abroad to continue their reign elsewhere. The notion that the killer stopped because he gradually lost interest as he got older lacks a definitive and therefore satisfying ending, the type you see in a good novel or a Hollywood film, in a piece of pulp fiction in other words. But I'm not here to indulge unrealistic cravings. I like to think that this channel is grounded in reality, and the real world is not neat and tidy. There are as many varieties of serial killers as there are serial killers, and the reason why serial killers start is in reality even less definitive than why they stop. Of the Jack the Ripper suspects, what explanations can be proposed for why they started? Consider these examples. The most common suggestion for Aaron Kosminski references his madness. According to Melville Macnaghten's memorandum, filed in Scotland Yard in 1894, Kosminski became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. That isn't much of an explanation, I would submit, but it was an opinion shared by Robert Anderson, who was Melville Macnaghten's superior at Scotland Yard, which takes away Anderson and Macnaghten's rationale as to why he started killing. If you want to find another rationale for Kosminski, anti-Jewish pogroms took place in Russian Poland in 1881 and 1882 and were probably the impulse for Kosminski's family to emigrate to England. These events might have traumatised or embittered Aaron Kosminski. But most Kosminski theorists believe he just started because he did. It's a bit like that First World War song that was popular with troops in the trenches. We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here. Only, with most Jack the Ripper suspects, the suggestion is no more sophisticated than he started because he started because he started because he started. Montague Jewett, for example, he also appeared in Macnaghten's memorandum. I've seen no explanation for Jewett starting. Maybe someone can tell me. Macnaghten offered he was sexually insane. At the time, this was usually a euphemism for homosexuality. According to the influential book Psychopathia Sexualis by Richard Fridolin Joseph Freiherr Kraft von Festenberg auf Frauenberg genannt von Ebbing, to give him his full title, usually shortened to Richard von Krafft-Ebing, published in 1886 and translated into English in 1892, obviously just 2 years before Macnaghten wrote his memorandum. The description sexually insane was pretty much reserved for homosexuals, who were regarded as being people who hated women, were insane maniacs, and so capable of any depredation. With Francis Tumblety, the suggestion is that he combined a deep hatred for women with the desire to harvest their internal organs, possibly for sale, possibly for his own supposed collection. Women hatred was an extrapolation from Tumblety's known homosexuality, but gay murderers are very seldom the serial killers of women, particularly when there's a lust component. With the sexual organs of the victims being specifically targeted, which is very contrary to the thesis found in Psychopathia Sexualis. George Hutchinson? For those who favour his guilt, he's a completely blank canvas, so you're free to make up anything you wish, which is usual for ripperology. With Jacob Levy, the suggestion is that he contracted syphilis from a prostitute, which both made him mad and gave him the desire to revenge himself upon the unfortunates of Whitechapel. It's also suggested that the death of his brother by unaliving himself in 1875, followed by the death of his father in 1886 and his mother in May 1888, caused trauma, and so were triggers. What of William Berry? His parents both died when he was very young, and he was brought up by an uncle. He lived a poor, semi-criminal lifestyle and moved to London from the Midlands in October 1887. He married someone with a small inheritance and then moved up to Dundee and killed her in February 1889. I don't think his background, the steps from birth to murder, presuming for a moment that he did become the Whitechapel murderer during his brief stay in the outer East End, has really been fleshed out. With Joseph Barnett, it suggested that he murdered prostitutes to scare his girlfriend Mary Kelly off the streets, and when this failed, he killed her as well. This kind of motive is commonly seen in a Scooby-Doo cartoon. Instead of wanting to scare those pesky kids, he wanted to scare his girlfriend. The case against James Maybrick is based on a diary that nearly everyone accepts as a forgery. If for a moment we pretend it isn't a forgery, then why did Maybrick become the Whitechapel murderer, the serial killer known to history as Jack the Ripper? He was supposedly enraged by his wife having an affair. Under the influence of drugs, he then conducted a murderous campaign in Whitechapel because there's a district in Liverpool, which is where he came from, also called Whitechapel. He also knew the area slightly because he once had an affair with a woman from Shadwell, which is in the East End, but not in Whitechapel. Francis Thompson, the poet, was supposedly in love with a prostitute who jilted him, and this is claimed to be the inspiration behind the murders. I would suggest that these proposed motivatums are inadequate to say the least, if not childishly simplistic. So what do I think? Why do serial killers start killing? In recent films, I've discussed FBI profilers. One, Jim Clemente, is an expert on psychopathic serial killers. He's described a three-stage process in their development. In other words, why they start, their motivation, which is different from what is commonly understood by motive. Stage one is genetics. Serial killers tend to be psychopaths, and they're born that way. Metaphorically, this loads the gun. Stage two is personality and psychology. You could be a psychopath, but also prone, for example, to be concerned about the consequences of being captured. You could be clever or rich and achieve your psychopathic kicks through business or politics, for example. This also relates to the more deep-seated events in a psychopath's life that negatively builds resentment. This is their personal environment. Metaphorically, this is aiming the gun. Stage three is the life experience prior to the crimes being committed, the immediate trauma or stress in their life which builds up to murder. Also, the events that allow them to plan and anticipate success due to familiarity or due to the anonymity of their surroundings that enable a psychopath to believe he can successfully carry out the crime. Metaphorically, this pulls the trigger of the gun. As Jim Clemente put it, it's a mix of bio, psycho and social. The biology is your genetics, what you're born with. Your psychology and your personality, you have a certain amount of it when you're born, but you actually participate in the development of that throughout your entire life. And then there's the events that happen in your life, your socialization. So the way I like to say it is, your genetics load the gun, your personality aims it, and the events in your life pull the trigger. It's almost certainly the case that the person responsible for the Jack the Ripper murders was a psychopath. This is stage one. As we don't have the luxury of being able to diagnose any of our suspects in person, we have to take it as an assumption that the culprit must have been a psychopath. I'll start by briefly sketching out why psychopathic serial killing is a relatively recent phenomenon. The most important point to take on board is that despite some historic exceptions, serial killing is closely associated with the rise in urbanisation. The human brain hasn't significantly evolved over the past 200,000 years. Until the last 200 years, the overwhelming majority of people lived in quite small rural communities. These communities were their tribe, for want of a better word. People shared their lives with relatives and other people with whom they are very familiar and comfortable, or let's say used to, because they'd often have fractious relationships even in small villages. But people would be familiar with other people's faults, and familiarity with one's peers acts as a brake on abhorrent behaviour. The human brain didn't evolve while people were living within a gigantic tribe of unfamiliar people. Our brain is built to handle intimate and small environments. We are not designed to live in cities where empathy tends to disappear. This results, for an example, for people who aren't psychopaths, in what is known as the bystander effect, where the more people there are around an emergency, the less likely you are to get assistance. In this age, people are more likely to film it on their phone than to help. We see the death of empathy. Psychopaths lack empathy anyway, certainly to all but their inner group. But when people tended to live in close-knit communities, it tended to keep psychopathic murder in check. Also, if a psychopath witnesses a traumatic event, he'll notice the facial expressions of other people in the stressful situation. He will then likely rehearse those facial expressions so he can mimic it when necessary. He can mimic surprise, pained innocence, sadness, interest. That's why psychopaths are good liars. In ascribing a motivation for the Jack the Ripper murders, as a starting point, we have to assume he was a psychopath. So, with Kosminski, he must have been a psychopath as well as a schizophrenic. Levy was suffering from syphilis, which caused his admission to an asylum in 1890 as a lunatic, suffering from the general paralysis of the insane, or neurosyphilis, which went on to kill him in 1891. He would have to have also been a psychopath who murdered while lucid and not suffering from the madness resulting from syphilis, even though he'd already been in an asylum in 1886. Druitt must have been a psychopath, even though, as an ardent participant in team sports such as cricket, this isn't likely. I haven't mentioned Lechmere so far. Like any other suspect, for him to have been guilty, he must have been born a psychopath. We can't say anything about his behaviours and other people's opinions of him besides what can be divined from his involvement in this case, but uniquely among the suspects we can examine his behaviour. What can we tell? The first matter that arises is Lechmere choosing to turn and face the person who approached him at Bucks Row just as he had murdered, we're presuming he was the culprit here for a second for this exercise, just as he had murdered Polly Nichols. Why didn't he flee into the night? If he was the killer, and so a psychopath, what would his response be when confronted with what is known as the clash dichotomy? Should I stay or should I go now? If I go, there will be trouble, and if I stay, it will be double. The Clash, a popular music ensemble from the late 1970s, were referring to the classic fight or flight syndrome. Fight, turn and brazen it out, in this case with Robert Paul, the man who approached Lechmere in Bucks Row, or flight, to flee into the unknown, towards the looming dead ground behind the board school, the direction from which P.C. Neal would be approaching. The direction towards a policeman on duty at the gateway of the Great Eastern Goods Depot, which he would be reaching just as the person we now know to be Robert Paul arrived where the body was and who might cry out, "Murder!" Does he fly into that unknown or turn and trust in his own plausibility? Remember, verbal communication is as important as non-verbal, facial expressions and body language. As I pointed out, psychopaths actually practice this and chillingly can mimic sincerity very accurately. They're used to being believed. During the making of the excellent documentary, The Missing Evidence, Jack the Ripper, featuring my good friend Christer Holmgren, Superintendent Andy Griffiths of the Sussex Murder Squad was adamant that the behaviour he would expect from a serial killer in these circumstances would be to turn and face the person who was approaching. It might seem counterintuitive that a killer would not just run away, but fight and not flight is the more likely response of a psychopath. So what happened next? As I said, if he was guilty, he would have been a plausible liar, so he'd have been able to disarm the following people he interacted with. Robert Paul, the man who he met at Bucks Row by the body of Polly Nichols. P.C. Misen, who he bumped into and briefly spoke to around the corner from Bucks Row. And the coroner at the inquest when he eventually turned up 3 days late. And his story raised no eyebrows, was not commented on by the reporters who witnessed his performance in the witness box, even though this was the only Whitechapel murder where the narrative of who found the body had to change 3 days later, and was the only instance where the chief witness, Lechmere, ended up in a crucial dispute with the policeman, P.C. Misen, over what was said between them. Let's now move on to stage 2, the suspect's personality or environment, the aiming of the gun. Kosminski was brought up in Poland, which was then under Russian occupation, where he probably experienced anti-Semitism, which could have caused internal resentment. Levy's wife actually stated that he was a good husband, a good father and a good businessman until the madness got hold of him over the last few years of his life, which was almost certainly a result of the syphilis that killed him. This implies he didn't previously exhibit any indications of psychopathic behaviour, which is a problem. Of the other suspects, not much can be said except perhaps Berry, whose parents died when he was quite young and he had a semi-criminal lifestyle prior to moving to the East End in 1887. But what of Lechmere? A couple of years after he was born, his natural father, John Allen Lechmere, abandoned his mother Maria and moved up to Northamptonshire, where he started another family. This left Charles Lechmere without a father figure. John Allen Lechmere was from the landed gentry of Herefordshire. His cousin was Lord of the Manor of Fownhope. Maria was also from Herefordshire, but from not such a posh family, but was still respectable. Her father was the butler to the wealthy Clive family, who were closely related to Clive of India fame. When her husband abandoned her, Maria moved to the East End of London with 2 children to raise, Charles Lechmere and his elder sister. What was that environment in which young Charles Lechmere spent his formative years without a father figure? They ended up in St George in the East. According to the poverty survey conducted by Charles Booth a few years later, the specific small area they lived in was the most overcrowded district in all of London. Remember what I said about the effect of crowded conditions upon someone born with psychopathy. The immediate area was known as Tiger Bay. It was the haunt of ferocious prostitutes who plied their trade among the unsuspecting sailors fresh off their ships that called into the nearby London docks. They came ashore with their pockets bulging full of cash, of which, by fair means or foul, they were soon relieved. This was about as far a cry from the verdant green Elysian fields and picturesque banks of the River Wye as could be imagined. Once in the East End, there were other formative influences on his immediate doorstep, not just somewhere vaguely in the East End. One of the first serial murders in British criminal history had occurred nearby a couple of decades before. I refer, of course, to the gruesome Ratcliffe Highway murders of 1811, when 7 people were viciously butchered in their own homes. This horrific event must have become part of local folklore. The victims were buried in St George in the East churchyard, the church where Charles Lechmere baptised all of his children. In 1857, a tiger escaped from the warehouse of Jamrach's Wild Animal Emporium just off that same Ratcliffe Highway. The tiger grabbed a young boy called John Wade in its mouth, and he had to be rescued by Charles Jamrach himself. John Wade was 8 years old at the time, the same age as Lechmere, and they lived very near each other. It's very likely that they attended the same school and knew each other. When he was an adult, John Wade lived a couple of streets away from Lechmere. A young boy being almost savaged to death by a ferocious tiger must have entered local folklore. In 1858, Charles Lechmere's mother, Maria, conducted a bigamous marriage with a man 10 years her junior, a near neighbour from Herefordshire who was engaged in the same trade as her absent father. They were both involved in the boot industry. This was Thomas Cross, who became a policeman. From the records we have, he must have been a large man. He had an outsized coffin, and he seems to have liked to drink. He was a local beat policeman and is recorded as having several run-ins with those prostitutes I mentioned before in the Tiger Bay area. Living next door to the local red light district and being the stepson of a local beat policeman must have been uncomfortable for young Lechmere. In the 1861 census, Thomas Cross increased his age by 10 years so that he would be old enough to be the father of Maria's children, and he also named them Cross. Being a bigamist would not have gone down well with the Metropolitan Police. Thomas Cross died in 1869, aged just 34. In 1870, Charles Lechmere married. What can we say of his background at this stage in his life? From the information, we can piece together quite a vivid picture. Living in the most overcrowded area of London, adjacent to the most violent red light district, was a marked contrast to rural Herefordshire. There were stark incidents of violence which are remembered to this day, the Ratcliffe Highway murders and Jamrach's tiger. Being abandoned by his biological father would have likely caused resentment. None of his children were named John, yet he favoured the Christian names of his aunts, his father's sisters. Consequential to this, there was the likelihood of him having mother issues, competing for her attention in the face of the new man in her life, a policeman of large stature, a young authority figure twice over. His mother must have been a strong-willed character. She thrived after being abandoned by her husband. She conducted 2 subsequent bigamous marriages and outlived all 3 of her purported husbands. She started a business that was continued by her grandson and her great-grandson. She brought up one of Charles Lechmere's daughters. If Charles Lechmere was guilty, this multitude of factors would have played upon a pre-existing psychopathic condition to create a lethal cocktail. The gun was aimed at the target. There's much more to come in this action-packed episode, so carry on watching, and by the way, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and the like button. Lastly, we get to stage 3, pulling the trigger, the immediate events. The overarching factor that allows psychopathic serial killers to pull the trigger is the relative anonymity of living in a densely populated urban environment. The risk of getting caught in a city is much less than in a village where everyone knows each other. This is one of the reasons why serial murders are associated with urban societies. Are there any triggers for Kosminski? We have his experiences in Russian-occupied Poland, those anti-Jewish pogroms. It could have caused resentment. Then there's the descent to madness. With Levy, there's the death of his father in 1886 and his mother in May 1888. For Francis Thompson being jilted by his prostitute girlfriend. For Barnett, Mary Kelly going back on the streets. Are there even these very light triggers for Tumblety, Hutchinson, Berry or Druitt? Tell me if you know any. I left Charles Lechmere at his marriage in 1870. I've already produced a film, there's a link in the description below, in which I suggest that the first murder committed by Charles Lechmere was the murder of Harriet Boswell in Great Coram Street in December 1872. So I've got to suggest triggers for that date. But as I believe his murderous career went through several phases, I'll do more than that. I'll suggest triggers for each phase. In July 1872, Lechmere's mother conducted her second bigamous marriage to Joseph Forsdyke, who this time was 10 years her senior and who was also involved in the boot industry. Forsdyke was a widower, his previous wife having only died 3.5 months before he married Maria. They immediately moved into the house Forsdyke had shared with his deceased wife. This house was knocked down in the mid-1880s to make way for a railway viaduct. The Pinchin Street torso was dumped under an arch of this viaduct about 20 feet away from the footprint of this very house. This happened in September 1889 while Joseph Forsdyke was sick from the illness that killed him a couple of months later. When the torso was discovered, it was noticed that on a wooden fence opposite the arch, someone had written some graffiti that read Lipsky, of which more later. Shortly after his mother married Joseph Forsdyke, Charles Lechmere, for the first time in his life, moved away and was separated from her apron strings. He moved from Mary Ann Street, where he had lived with his mother prior to her marriage, to Antcliffe Street. As she abandoned him by marrying Forsdyke, he abandoned her. Dr. Kahn's Anatomical and Pathological Museum, close to what is now Piccadilly Circus, was a display of what were known as anatomical Venuses. These were salacious, reclining, lifelike waxwork figures of naked women, with their insides open and gratuitously displayed as a supposed medical aid, so that student doctors could better understand the position and shape of various internal organs of the human body, without having to dissect an actual corpse. These were in short supply, particularly after the execution of body snatchers such as Burke and Hare. For a small fee, anyone, not just people associated with the medical profession, could gawp at the exposed inner anatomy of a woman. It was very popular. Christer Holmgren, in his excellent book Cutting Point, Solving the Jack the Ripper and Thames Torso Murders, highlighted the striking similarity between the anatomical Venuses and how Jack the Ripper displayed his victims, particularly Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly. If you want to read this important book, I'll provide a link in the description below. In 1872, when the murder of Harriet Boswell took place, Charles Lechmere's uncle, Whitmore Lechmere, and his children, Charles Lechmere's cousins, lived in Lisle Street. He was another bootmaker. This address is a couple hundred yards from Dr. Kahn's museum and about 100 yards from where Harriet Boswell spent Christmas Eve, her last night before she was murdered. It's certain that Lechmere was in contact with his Lechmere uncle and aunts, who all lived in the West End, as he named his children after them. I would suggest that Charles Lechmere became familiar with Dr. Kahn's museum and from there gained knowledge of human anatomy. The Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, is believed to have been similarly inspired by gruesome anatomical waxwork displays in Morecambe. I mentioned that Charles Lechmere had several aunts who lived in the West End. One was called Harriet and another Emma. Charles Lechmere's daughter, born in 1888, was called Harriet Emma. Emma Catherine Lechmere was the youngest of his aunts. In 1871, she married Charles Very, a rich restaurateur whose highly fashionable restaurant, Very's, was on Regent Street. It was patronised by Bertie, the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, and Conan Doyle had his fictional detective Sherlock Holmes sent there for takeaways. Charles Lechmere's grandmother, Mary Lechmere, lived with Emma and Charles Very. Through Charles Very's fortune, which he left to Emma when he died, the West End aunts became quite rich. Not only was Charles Lechmere the poor relation compared to his cousins still in Herefordshire, living it up in Foundhope as lords of the manor, he was also the poor relation compared to his aunts in the West End, who fell on good fortune courtesy of Very's restaurant, another potential cause of resentment. So for the first murder we have quite a list that layered up upon each other until that trigger was pulled. Back to Dr. Kahn's museum. The exhibition had been on show in London for over 20 years, but by February 1873, the authorities had finally had enough. Under pressure from the Society for the Suppression of Vice, the police raided the establishment, the doors were closed, waxwork figures were impounded, and most were destroyed. I haven't yet done a film about the first of the Thames torso murders, the so-called Battersea torso of September 1873, but never fear, I will soon. I believe the closure of Dr. Kahn's museum denied Lechmere the opportunity for salacious satisfaction, which he achieved via this first torso victim. In 1876, a carman working for Pickford's, who called himself Charles Cross, ran over and killed a 4-year-old boy called Walter Williams in Islington. This might have been Charles Lechmere, as he worked for Pickford's and went under the name Charles Cross when he appeared at the inquest into the death of Polly Nichols, the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. The inquest into the boy's death found that it was an accident, but the boy's father thought otherwise. If this was Charles Lechmere, then it might have given him a sense of invincibility in being able to kill and escape punishment, and encouraged him in his murderous career. Now let's turn to the build-up to the Jack the Ripper murders. The specific part of the East End that Charles Lechmere was brought up in, St George in the East, was also the first to experience the first waves of Jewish migration from 1881 onwards, as it was adjacent to the London docks. This was the migration that brought Aaron Kosminski to London. One consequence was that the pre-existing German community in that district moved away along with the sugar factories with which they were associated. Another consequence was that the red light district of Tiger Bay was squeezed out and cleaned up. And another consequence was the overcrowding I mentioned earlier. And yet another was the growth of anti-Semitism. It would not be surprising if this increased Charles Lechmere's feelings of resentment, as expressed perhaps in the Galston Street graffiti. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. In July 1886, while a gas main was being repaired at the junction of Cable Street and Cannon Street Road, the workers came across the skeleton of a man with a stake driven through its heart. It was the body of John Williams, who had been accused of the Ratcliffe Highway murders that I mentioned earlier, but who unalived himself, as I must say, before he could be brought to justice. This brought that whole gruesome affair back to public attention. This junction was just a few hundred yards away from James Street, where Charles Lechmere was living at the time. In June 1887, on Batty Street, again just a few hundred yards away from James Street, Israel Lipsky murdered Miriam Angel by making her take acid. Lipsky was executed for his crime in August 1887. The case caused a nationwide sensation. I would suggest this would have an impact upon a local psychopath. Remember that the word Lipsky was daubed on a fence opposite to where the Pinchin Street torso was dumped, and also a witness called Israel Schwartz claimed a man shouted Lipsky at him as he walked down Berner Street just before Liz Stride was murdered, one of the canonical victims attributed to Jack the Ripper. This was one street over from Batty Street. I mentioned earlier that in 1872 Charles Lechmere had moved away from the immediate area where his mother lived to Antcliffe Street. This was temporary, and when he was at James Street he again lived very close to where his mother lived with Joseph Forsdyke. However, in June 1888 Lechmere moved from James Street to Doveton Street in a totally different district. Was this separation a release? How did it affect Charles Lechmere psychologically? His children had to change schools from Bet Street School to Essex Street School. Bet Street was where Jamrach's tiger had escaped from. It was just off the Ratcliffe Highway. Did this change of school remind Charles Lechmere of that earlier incident involving John Wade? I mentioned earlier that the relative anonymity of living in a densely populated urban environment lessened the risks of a psychopathic serial killer being caught, and that this is one reason why serial killing is associated with the rise of urban society. Most such serial killers are not totally risk averse. They would weigh situations up. Charles Lechmere had worked for Pickford's at Broad Street goods station for over 20 years by 1888. For most of that time, Lechmere was living at James Street. He would have walked through the streets of Whitechapel back and forth every day. Over these years, he had become familiar with every street and alleyway, which were busy and which were empty. He would learn where the late-night sex workers tended to ply their trade. He would learn where policemen walked their nighttime beats. He'd be able to fantasise about what he intended to do and how long he'd have to do it, and rehearse it time and again in his head before he actually did it. In my opinion, he'd already killed many times before, but not in such risky circumstances, so he'd know how to do it quickly and silently. The realisation that committing these crimes was possible was a key motivation in moving from aiming the gun to pulling the trigger. I'll briefly return to the Torso murders. Firstly, Lechmere married Elizabeth Bostock in 1870. She lived very close to the River Thames, just off Wapping High Street. Her father, Thomas Bay Bostock, was a lighterman. He worked on the river unloading ships that moored in the river, using the tides to manoeuvre his boat. Being aware of the river's tides would have been very advantageous to the Thames Torso killer, who dumped most of his body parts in the River Thames. Secondly, Lechmere's mother, Maria, became heavily involved in the wholesale cat's meat business, which involved cutting up horse flesh, which was obtained from local slaughter yards, probably mainly from the Harrison Barber yard around the corner from where Polly Nichols was murdered in 1888. I would suggest that this would have been useful for Lechmere in hiding the torso body parts and in learning basic butchering skills. Incidentally, there's nothing to link Maybrick, Tumblety, Thompson, Druitt or Berry to these back streets. Lechmere worked as a carman, a delivery cart driver, the equivalent of a white van man today. The most common occupation for serial killers is, you guessed it, a lorry driver or white van man. While on his cart alone, delivering his goods, he would have time to think, to ponder, to evaluate. He realised he had the opportunity to kill on those very same streets. This was his final motivation to pull the trigger. When he moved to Doveton Street, away from his mother, the murders commenced. Again, we have a detailed list of triggers for the street killings, the canonical Jack the Ripper murders. I've been at pains to emphasise that serial killers of this type are almost always psychopaths. They get their kicks from killing, the ultimate control over life and death. That is the primary reason why they kill. They're usually unsuccessful and feel thwarted. That's why they want to exercise this sort of control or power. Successful or more capable psychopaths tend to get their kicks through other activities, for example in business, in politics or in the armed forces. There's a fairly obvious sexual aspect to these murders. We see overkill. The wounds are usually much more drastic than is necessary to kill the victims. Where this isn't the case, it's almost certainly due to the culprit being disturbed. This overkill manifests itself in a form of piquerism, either slashing or, in the case of Martha Tabram, stabbing, which is regarded as an indicator of a sexual motivation. There was attention to the sexual reproductive organs insofar as the wounds were concerned. In several instances, organs were taken away, which is again indicative of a desire to control. The murders characterised by these actions occupied a brief, almost frantic period, a few months, although it should be borne in mind that other unsolved murders of a similar type of victim took place both before and after. Horrific murders of this type can be perpetrated by supposedly happily married killers with children, such as Fred West or Dennis Rader, or by people who are married or with partners but without children, such as Peter Sutcliffe or Ted Bundy. There are no rules with serial killers. What we've been discussing here is the underlying motivation that triggered someone to start this killing spree. This is different from a motive, as is commonly understood. These are motiveless crimes in that there is not a motive of robbery, or what is often called a crime of passion, or a political assassination, or to silence someone in case they might say something incriminating, or to cash in on an insurance policy, or due to some sort of hatred or rivalry, or as an act of terrorism. The motive is the act of killing itself, but there are motivations behind that. So do you think I've painted a credible picture for Lechmere as to why he started his murderous career? Presuming, of course, that you agree he started a murderous career in the first place. If not, I hope I've given you pause to ponder why your favourite suspect started, whether or not he's one of the ones who I've mentioned in the course of this film. I hope at least I'll put an end to the inadequacy of he started because he started because he started because he started, or simplistic Scooby-Doo type motivations or Midsummer Murder plot lines. Thank you for watching, and to help those awkward and ever-changing YouTube algorithms, please subscribe, share, like and comment below.